Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. I'm Jordan Jones. I'm here with Dr. Bob Cargill, and today we are very excited to be joined by Dr. Dan McClellan. You probably know Dan from all things internet, but also if you have somehow missed his podcast, the Data Over Dogma podcast, take a moment. You can go and get that in your inbox right now because Dan does everything wonderful there, and we're so happy to have join us here today for a discussion of biblical idols. Dan, thank you for taking the time today to talk through this controversial topic.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
We are big fans of everything that you do, and we know our audience sometimes has questions. I mean, I see the comments sometimes where it'll be in there if it's Dan has a video on this, or Dan, what do you think about this? So for all of you commenters, we've got Dan here for you today as well to get
so knock it off, right?
Right. To get some of Dan's perspective in here. No, feel free, leave them down. We're not perfect. We're always happy to have the pushback one way or another. And I think this is one of those topics that when we think through what do people think about this, idols in the Bible, before we can jump into some of the stories that probably immediately come to people's mind, I think it would be helpful for us to step back and do a little bit of stage dressing and define some terms. So Dan, for our audience, what is an idol as far as the Hebrew Bible is thinking of an idol? Is it the same as like immediately jumps into our modern minds, or do we need to be reframing that?
I think there is a degree to which we need to be reframing things, because I think the central focus of most people's ideas about idols is that they're objects of worship, which they absolutely are, but that's not their central function. That is a caricature, I think. And I think it's part of the idol polemics that we see in the Hebrew Bible. The authors who are denigrating idols represent them as just there for worship. But I think the central function of an idol, which I generally use divine image as a slightly less polemical term, but I think the central function there is to just manifest the presence of the deity for whatever function or purpose, because it can facilitate divination. It can facilitate all different kinds of activity besides just worship. And worship is certainly one of the things that it's there to do. But anything that you would want or need the presence of a deity for, that's what a divine image or an idol does. And so to just reduce it down to an object of worship, I think obscures exactly what's going on for the sake of the polemical function of the criticisms that we see.
And let me jump in with and again, thanks for being here, Dan. Let me jump in with the natural modern equivalent question, which is, I agree with you that when they talk about a pestle or an idol, that the especially later in the Hebrew text, there's a polemic definition that's, you're worshiping this object made of wood or made of stone or made of metal or something like that. And that's clearly not the case, that this is something that is representative of the deity that is larger than this. It's not just the object. It's to help focus the mind upward onto the deity. I agree with you. The question then is, if we go into, let's say, a cathedral or a Greek Orthodox church, and we see modern icons, or we see a crucifix, and we see a graven image or a painting of Christ there, are those not doing the exact same thing? Are they not either graven or painted images that are designed to focus the mind on the one true God that is up above? And if that's the case, is that not a prohibited practice per the Ten Commandments?
I think it's absolutely doing the same thing, and I think it can be a little fuzzy, because when I talk about an idol manifesting the presence of deity, I think there's this idea, this conceptualization that somehow this object, this material media, is actually bringing the deity into your presence. And absolutely, I think things like relics and icons and things like that are conceptualized that way. People will go into a church and they will look at it and they will feel the presence of the deity, and they will perceive that the deity is present there. But I think the same can also be said about some people's understanding of the Bible and their use and approach to the Bible. When they see the divine name, when they think, oh, I'm communing with the Spirit or with God, when I'm reading, it's functioning in the exact same way. And this is one of the reasons in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, I argue that it's not just a clean break with all things idol. It's a renegotiation of what we're going to consider appropriate material media for facilitating the deity's presence and what we're going to consider inappropriate material media. And I think we just have a shift towards primarily moving towards a textual conceptualization of the kinds of media that can bring the deity near. And, the law is represented in many ways. The Torah, for instance, you have Moses and then Joshua are commanded to write the words of the law upon standing stones. And traditionally, standing stones are divine images, are idols. And so now what we're doing is we're overlaying the law on the standing stone. And then in later tradition, we just get rid of the standing stone. And now the law is what we read to have God's presence with us. And so I do think that it's functioning like that. I don't think that it's a black and white, clear binary of, oh, that's prohibited. Everybody who's doing that is wrong. Because I think we see these kinds of material media in the Hebrew Bible and even to some degree in the New Testament, where there's something that is bringing the deity near. And I have argued that actually Jesus is functioning as a divine image in the sense that Jesus possesses and manifests the divine presence and power and authority, but is not actually the deity. And in that sense, Jesus is doing the same thing that divine images do. So I certainly can sympathize with the perception that what is going on in particularly Orthodox Catholic traditions with icons and relics and things like that feels awfully close to what's going on with idols in the Hebrew Bible. But at the same time, the Bible's the same way for a lot of people. And so I think we're trying to draw lines around things to basically gatekeep and engage in boundary maintenance and say, these are the members of the group that we don't like. So we're going to draw a line to push them out. And I think that's the way a lot of the conceptualization of divine images works. It's an identity marker that we want to use to curate the boundaries that we like and that are most beneficial to us.
Now, two things. One, have you ever received any pushback at all on the idea of Jesus as a divine image, but not? I mean, I'm guessing you might have received one or two small pieces of
probably the calmest thing that you get comments.
Well, it's an interesting concept, is what I'm saying. It's he's God, but he's not. But he is the representation of the deity on earth, and to the point where you just touch the hem of his garment, and you're. I mean, and these are relics that he leaves behind.
Manifesting the presence.
Yeah, no, it's. And then there's this debate about whether or not. I mean, that's a fascinating concept. I had never thought about Jesus as, I don't say an idol, but as clearly the divine presence on earth. Yeah. But in the context of idols, I'm wondering if you've ever received pushback on that.
An awful lot on social media, not an awful lot in professional spheres. Right. Sure. But it actually stems from research. I can still remember very clearly. I was looking at it was the Festschrift for Frank Moore Cross, Ancient Israelite Religion, very famous book for those of us who. You probably got a copy somewhere, but I was in the Radcliffe Camera in Oxford because that was the only place I could find access to this book. This was before Anna's Archive and LibGen and all those places that nobody should ever go to. But I was reading Thorkel Jacobson's paper in that volume on the graven image. And he kind of lays it out so clear that it's this seeming paradox between is and is not. because the idol both is the deity and is not the deity. And I was working on my master's thesis at the time, and a light bulb went on over my head. It's like, this is the exact same debate of early Christology. It both is and is not. And so I argue that the intuitive impulse, and I use the cognitive science of religion to develop this framework for understanding how people intuitively conceptualize divine images. I developed this framework and suggest that this is what is underlying both how people treat divine images in ancient West Asia, as well as how the early Christians treated Jesus before we had this philosophical framework developed for understanding how Jesus could both be linked with the deity while also being distinguished from God the Father. So I've not had much pushback at all. On social media, all the pushback.
Yeah, sure. And the other one being, and I want to spend a moment here, this concept of the transition from the Israelite religion, let's call it, from being a religion that that likely involved idols, or whatever we want to call them, objects. We have them every time you throw a pick in the ground, you're going to pull these things up. We know that the prophets were running around saying, please knock this off, repeatedly. Going from that to, there you go. Yeah.
I just got this in the mail.
Oh, did you?
A supporter 3D printed me a Tanakh cult stand, about 2/3 size, but example.
Excellent. That's this is a thing that you can do now. And again, like me, proponents of buying replicas, and you can do this now with 3D printers. Don't go and buy and try to buy these actual objects. Buy the replicas. You can get them almost looking identical now. Yeah. Cuts down on looting, cuts down on forgery. Et cetera, et cetera.
And I can do whatever I want with this. I'm not going to hurt it.
Right. That's right. You always get another one.
No fear of
That's
breaking.
awesome. That's excellent. But we know that there was this transition away from, or at least this claim, from the banishment of idolatry. And it coincides with, everybody calls, the religion of a book, but the growth of the priestly and the scribal communities. And, this is me, betraying that I'm a student of Schneidlin, right? The rise of these scribal communities as the text becomes more important, as the priestly communities become more important, they begin to constrain the king and these kinds of things. You have the growth of the importance of the written text. Two, I think what you mentioned, that the written text itself begins to become a quasi idol. It becomes, as you mentioned, it gets written on the standing stone, which used to be a representative of a deity. And for some reason, that's okay. That's commanded by God. And then the text itself, the Torah, becomes something that is sacred. You can't touch it with your fingers. It's got the divine name in it. And we can't say that. We can't even write the divine name after a while. This progresses as well, to the point now in the US and that the book is actually this sacred thing. It's inerrant. It's infallible. It is almost a deity in itself.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, and we see this turn within Protestantism as well. Protestantism is kind of escalating that rhetoric that we find in Greco-Roman period Jewish history, post-exilic Judaism, and they're doubling down on it and saying, "No, we're getting rid of all of the material trappings of Orthodox and Catholic worship." But then I think the fundamental impulse here is that we want something that is imminent. We want something that is near, that we can touch, that we can see. That is just an innate kind of impulse when it comes to worship and what we have labeled religion. And I think the Bible is all that Protestants have left for themselves, which is why it fills that role. And to say that it's inerrant and it's inspired and it's all these things is basically to say everything but the book is God. And, they have a lot of ways to rhetorically kind of distinguish, to draw that really thin line between the two. But yeah, I see it as not as a rejection of all material media that brings the divine presence. I see it as just a renegotiation of where we're allowed to do things, and I think we see it in the practice of the mezuzot and the tefillin, because we've got text with the divine name on it that goes inside these enclosures of some kind or another. And we touch them, we put them on our forehead. We do, not we, certainly not me, but members of that community do that in an effort to commune with the deity and to follow these laws. And they're treated in the exact same ways that we see divine images treated. The putting a mezuzah on the door frame. Any archaeologist or anybody who's ever been to an archaeological dig in Israel and Palestine has probably seen standing stones right at the entrance of a city, which represents the deity's protection, oversight, represents that liminal space, does all the exact same stuff. And I'm also fascinated by the earliest version of any text from the Bible that we have. The Kathryn silver scrolls. I think the divine name appears 7 or 8 times across the 2 different scrolls. But what were they? They were an apotropaic amulet, because in my opinion, the perception that writing the divine name on this silver scroll does kind of the same thing that the activation of the divine image over in Mesopotamia or in Egypt did, where the adding the name is what brings the presence into the approved material, and then you roll it up tight and you keep it with you as a reminder. And there have been a bunch of folks who've written on that, on the amulets and how their storage, their encapsulation within this compartment kind of functions almost as like a mini sacred space. So doing the same kind of thing that a temple does, demarcates this sacred space within which the divine image functions. And I think that's just something that folks who worship the God of the Bible are not going to be able to divest themselves from. They need that presence with them, whether it's through the Bible, whether it's through tefillin or a mezuzah or something like that. But yeah, I don't think we can get away from it. And so I don't think we can get away from, in some sense, needing this thing that we've labeled idols. But because it's become so demonized and so vilified in the Bible, I think it's something that's negotiable. And going back to what I said previously, so frequently it comes down to they're doing it wrong, we do it right. And it's all about drawing those boundaries between who's good and who's bad, who's right and who's wrong, and that's all relative and negotiable.
I want to jump on the making the presence immediate. There's this need, and a story is probably ringing in some listeners' minds, Exodus 32, with one of these maybe most frequent examples of biblical idols, the story of the golden calf, that it gets the Sunday school rendition usually of people. But as we're walking through this, I want to ask you, Dan, as you're presenting different perspectives of how we could be thinking about idols. On the one hand, do you think everyone in this story, whether it's the people and Aaron and Moses, are seeing the calf in the same way? Are they seeing this as just a manifestation, or is this the thing to be worshipped? Because it normally gets kind of condensed together as this gets read. But if we're looking at their individual vocalizations, maybe things start to open up. So how do you feel like Exodus 32 is presenting that community's understanding of the calf?
I think this is probably a polemical narrative. So we're seeing it through the eyes of the author who wants this to be something bad. But I think they're probably representing, obviously in a twisted way, something that would have been considered perfectly normative and perfectly acceptable in the early history of Israel, using a calf, more likely a bull. I think the calf is probably a diminutive effort to kind of mock a little bit, but we have a lot of bull imagery, and there from in the material media of that time and place, but also in the text. Adonai is represented as a bull in a variety of different ways, which aligns with the representation of the storm deity in the Northwest Semitic pantheon, as well as with the patriarchal high deity in the Northwest Semitic pantheon. And so I think the notion that Adonai is represented as a bull was probably considered pretty normative. And so I think they probably would have understood the calf either as a pedestal animal, as we see with like Baal astride a bull in some imagery, or as the representative animal, as the image that presenced the deity. And so I think there were probably a few different ways that people conceptualized the divine image. But what we have in Exodus is an attempt to say, no, this is wrong. An attempt to, in my opinion, again, draw lines around what's acceptable divine imagery and what's unacceptable, because the Ark of the Covenant functions as a divine image in all ways and shapes and forms as well. It does the exact thing that a divine image does. You bring it out. You consult with it to decide whether or not we're going to go to battle. You march it in front of the army and everybody cheers, and the Philistines go, the gods have come into the camp. You have Moses talking about the ark going out and coming in, and God is basically mirroring whatever movement and action the ark is doing. And so in every way, I think it's also functioning as a divine image. And I have a theory, I need to work on it a little more, but I have a theory that I mentioned the Tanakh cult stand, which in my opinion is probably the merging of an incense altar with a shrine model. And the shrine model was a way to miniaturize and mobilize divine space. And so you would have miniature divine images that went in it. And we have examples of these. The where is it from? Is it from Dotan? The calf, the little miniature calf, probably went inside of a shrine model as well. Well, the standard divine image that we know from Arad, for instance, and from the Bible and from many other places is a standing stone. So if we got two standing stones, what's a miniature version of a standing stone? Well, it's a little tablet. And if the Ark of the Covenant is functioning as a shrine model, where would your little miniature divine images go? Well, they go in the Ark of the Covenant. Right. And so and some other people have hinted at a very similar theory. I'm trying to unpack it more, but we talked about the law being written on standing stones. Well, what if the law being written on two little tablets that were then placed inside of this potential shrine model is doing exactly what shrine models do, housing miniature divine images, and in this case, miniature stelae or standing stones with the law written upon them. So I think the golden calf episode is going to be followed up shortly with a description of how you're going to make the Ark of the Covenant and what it's going to be for and everything like that. And I think they're distinguishing appropriate divine images from inappropriate divine images.
Circling back as well to your Jesus question or note from earlier, when the story opens, and I hadn't thought about this until you said this, but the people say, we don't know what happened to this Moses guy. And then there's the call to make. Is that potentially presenting Moses as a mediation of the divine presence? Because we're going to get this when Moses goes up the mountain and comes back down, and they're like, we can't look at you. Yeah. Is it doing something similar there that maybe they're thinking of Moses as mediating the divine presence and that gets transferred to the calf?
I think there's certainly a degree to which they're playing with how deity is mediated. Because Moses comes down, you got the horns of light, let's say, coming out of Moses' face, both of which are representative of deity, and this is like the Melamu. This is the glory that shines from deity or things that are divine. And we have in Exodus 7, God says, "I'm going to make you a god to Pharaoh." And so Moses is represented, I think, as bearing the divine presence to some degree. And again, I think we're toying with the boundaries between what is appropriate divine mediation and what is inappropriate divine mediation. And I think the Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord, is another example of that, because the angel does all the same stuff, and I've argued is a textual interpolation meant to kind of put distance between humanity and whoever this divine figure is. But then the angel goes on to say, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And so the angel both is and is not the deity. And so I think there are a few different ways that the authors, and Exodus is a compilation of a number of different literary layers. But I think there are a few different ways that the authors are toying with this idea of divine mediation and trying to distinguish what we're going to consider appropriate from what we're going to consider inappropriate.
I think you're right on the money with the Ark of the Covenant. We've done a couple of shows on a couple of episodes on basically the nature of the Ark of the Covenant. And, I focus more on what happened to it and why it disappeared and who I think is responsible for its disappearance. But I think you're right on the money. It wasn't considered an idol, because it's ours and not yours, and yours is always bad and ours is good. Yeah. But as you'll notice that the text that says that into it they put a copy of the tablets comes later, so that as you get the copy of these tablets, and again, the treaties were usually you give one to one party of the treaty and one to the other party of the treaty. In the treaties that you have between Israel and the deity, you get the pot, the fire going through, and then you get Abram going through. Both of them are going to be housed in the ark, right? So they're going to keep them. It's not like 5 commandments on one and 5 commandments on the other. They probably both had copies of the law. It's 2 copies, but they both went in because one's for the deity, and they're housed in the ark, by the way, which is still the practice today in synagogues and temples, right? You have an ark up front, which houses the scroll. Right. So this is an accepted practice to this day. And that was something that was considered okay. This isn't an idol. This is our box for marching. But you also had that existing history of, but when we go into war, you can't touch it or you die. God speaks through it. So you also had that tradition.
And it does battle with the enemy's divine image.
Correct.
It goes where divine images go, and it does battle with the divine image.
Right. So when the Philistines put it next to Dagon, it's his hands are cut off and it's falling down. So you still have, even though they were trying to make that transition to, no, this thing's okay because it's just housing the written text like the Ark does today, it was still understood to be this thing. So it was still highly problematic. And so that as long as they were a nomadic people, they carried it around. As soon as they built that temple and they were a landed people and they had the big thing and they, 7 steps and do a sacrifice and they put it in there, we don't hear about it anymore.
No.
And so, the theory that we've discussed is that it wasn't the Babylonians or the Romans or somebody, it was Hezekiah. I think that in Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18, when he's listing, I destroyed the Nehushtan, which we also need to discuss. Mm-hmm. I destroyed the Bamot and the Matzebot and including the Matzebot, right? Including these standing stones, including these places. I think that the Ark was perhaps listed in there, and somebody else came along later and said, you can't destroy, and they just erased it, and that was the end of it. But I think it became so problematic. And now that we have a temple, the temple takes on all the veneration that was once ascribed to the Ark, and that solves the problem. We have the written text, Hilkiah is doing his thing a little late. And so it becomes the temple and the scroll. We have the scroll, we have the temple, and you don't need the Ark anymore. I think they got rid of it themselves. And then later on, they realized, this that doesn't make for a good documentary. You can't sell tickets doing that, right? But but I like your theory because that's exactly right. It's not, they were able to find a utility for it it's a trunk, right? It's a carrying case.
Yeah.
It
Just
wasn't,
a box.
Yeah, no, it's just hey, this
convenience. That's all. That's all the ark. It's transportation.
And as long as you can be practical and have a utility for it, then you can extend its life. And I think I think that has something to do with it as well. I think you're absolutely right with that.
I think there's and David Aaron in his book Biblical Ambiguities talks quite a bit about how the function of the ark overlaps with divine images. And then Ranan Eichler has an interesting theory about the Aaron's budding rod being an Asherah. Being another divine image that would go into the ark. And he comes up with this, his theory is that the story of where this budding rod came from was created precisely to rationalize, to justify why this thing that looks an awful lot like an Asherah, what it's doing in our ark.
Right.
So I think you certainly have a lot of rewriting of history, renegotiating that history in an effort to kind of make everything okay that was normative before, but now we've decided is no longer normative. We've got to find a reason for it. And I think it's fascinating too, the way the scribal class kind of takes on a kind of a priestly function. They are now the overseers of the divine images, if the texts are the divine images now, and certainly that was no accident that the people who are in charge of the tradition are suddenly like, oh, it turns out we are in charge of the most powerful part of our whole tradition. Oh, what a coincidence!
Yeah, no, it's. And
very
Aaron's
convenient
rod,
the way that works out.
Yeah. And Aaron's rod as an Asherah certainly would fit with the Kirbet el-Kom inscriptions that we have. You know, it with the deity and his Asherah. You know, that tradition is still there, right? It was the el-Kom inscriptions, right, where we have these blessings. Is that correct?
Quintilet Ajrud and Kirbet el-Kom both have references to Adonai and his Asherah. And I would bring up also the Lachish Ewer, where we have the inscription of, to the lady, the goddess. And right underneath it are some ibexes on either side of a stylized tree that has a main trunk and then 3 semicircular branches coming out from the main trunk. Looks an awful lot like early representations of the menorah. Another object that is in the temple that is is being accounted for in in ways that make it seem a lot less divine than it probably originally was understood to be.
Bob, you already mentioned this one, but as we're talking about utilitarian objects that get connected with the temple, I think we have to circle back to the Nehushtan. Talking about the calf of what's appropriate and what's a non-appropriate image. When we get down to Numbers, this is a story that people may be less familiar with. The Israelites are doing their thing. They're complaining again. And as a result, right, we get the poisonous or maybe fiery serpents that get sent in. And in this case, God tells Moses to make an image that's going to spare these people. So whereas in Exodus 32, right, it's setting out that this is an inappropriate divine image. Dan, is there anything about this one that feels like it moves the rationale as to why this one gets no condemnation? Because it also stays around until those cultic reforms, and it had been placed in the temple and it's still there. So why does the Nehushtan get a pass?
I think this is another instance where it's because it was commanded by God. And so very similar to how priesthood divination is it's just like necromancy. It's just like all different kinds of divination, but it's okay when we do it because God has told us to do it. And it's actually God on the other end of the line. And so here the idea is the way the story is told, it's God commanding Moses to do this. And I think the story was probably created to rationalize why there's this bronze serpent that seems to be understood to channel divine power of some kind. And the story probably developed around it where God was like, oh, I need a tool. So make this thing and then I'm going to work through it. And that's going to facilitate the healing. even though snakes were associated with healing in different societies in ancient West Asia. And so it would have made perfect sense as a divine image. And so I think we see a lot of that going on. And then perhaps the group that came up with the story from the book of Numbers is related to the group that later talks about how, oh yeah, they started to worship that thing, so we had to drag it out and destroy it. And I think, I'm interested in Hezekiah and Josiah's reforms. How much of that is historical versus how much of that is later literary creation?
Correct.
But I think between the two of them, they're responsible for the shape of Judaism going forward, going into and then coming back out of the exile, the way they've reshaped things, in my opinion, to serve their own interests and to structure power in favor of their own interests. I think that's probably what's going on there. And the Northern Kingdom, since it's no longer around, is the perfect scapegoat. We're going to blame them for everything that we were doing. And so Hezekiah becomes the hero that gets rid of this thing that God told them to make. Another fascinating example of something in Israel's past that they've had to negotiate with and find a way to either and or rationalize and make good, or rationalize and then destroy.
Right.
And the rationalization part of this, I think many people are probably hearing this story. If you're hearing it in church, maybe it's if you had faith, right? The ones that look at the serpent.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we're continuing that rationalization. God told Moses to make an idol. Why is this okay? Oh, it's a test of faith. And the ones that have faith, look. So we're continuing to do the rationalization process, and then it gets destroyed later, and we're okay with that.
And for viewers who aren't familiar, there's a religious reform by King Hezekiah. There's a later religious reform by Josiah, and scholars there are not in agreement over whether both of these religious reforms actually took place, as the Bible says, whether one of these is actually copied from the other. So, for instance, Hezekiah's reform, what really happened, and Josiah's reform didn't really happen, but they wanted to give credit to Josiah for reform, so they just basically copied. Or Josiah's reform was real, and they wanted to make Hezekiah look good, so that they copied it backwards, or that neither of those reforms were actual historical, and that this is all a concoction from the scribes, from the redactors, who wanted to give credit to these two. I think certainly we have evidence, archaeological evidence, that Hezekiah was, again, from Sennacherib's annals and these things, that Hezekiah was trying to do something, preparing for some kind of rebellion, and he was trying to consolidate power in Jerusalem. And one of the ways that you consolidate power is consolidate religious power around Jerusalem by getting rid of all of the other places. And one of the ways that you do that is force people to worship only in Jerusalem. But again, does that mean that you get rid of the ark? And because you have the temple now, and you get rid of the possibility of a mobile. These are all the things, but then again, Josiah and that reform is the one that's associated with the discovery of the book of Deuteronomy, right?
Another very convenient event.
Correct.
It was lying in the corner. It was just hidden. It was always there.
We just had to rediscover it, right?
Yeah.
Well, and that raises a question, something that I've always been fascinated by. One of my favorite places in Israel and Palestine to visit is Arad, because we've got this temple, a Judahite temple, where they discovered texts with the names of priestly families on them, and there's this well-preserved standing stone and a couple of incense altars that were discovered right around the Holy of Holies, the Devir, and so that's another example of what we could call an idol operative within a First Temple period Judahite temple that was obviously under the authority of the central authority in Jerusalem. And I've heard, and there are a handful of different theories regarding why this temple was dismantled, whether it was decommissioned or destroyed. There's the idea that initially the theory was, this was Hezekiah's reforms. He was But people are like, but he didn't destroy anything. He kind of laid the divine image on its side and laid the incense altars on their side, and then just covered it in 6 feet of earth and just moved on. That's not how you don't destroy a high place or a temple by just carefully covering it in dirt. You actually break the things. And so another theory is that this was done to hide it from the invading forces, from Sennacherib, who was coming through and ended up destroying most of the main cultic centers in and around Judah and the northern kingdom. And then the question is, well, why didn't they come back? And in my opinion, you probably get that centralization of the focus of worship onto Jerusalem was probably the result of, it was a de facto centralization. Sennacherib's destroyed everything. Nothing's really operative. And then you get the next couple of kings, Manasseh and I forget the name of the other king, but they are represented in the literature as trying to restore the worship going on in other temples and the worship of other deities. And so I think they probably were trying to restore things until we get to Josiah, who's suddenly like, I don't like this. Hey, turns out I found a book that said we're not supposed to be doing it anyway, so knock it off, guys. And so I think I would love more clarity on that process of what went on between Hezekiah and Sennacherib and Josiah and the way worship functioned. I think that's such a pivotal point in the history of ancient Israel and Judah. And I wish we knew more about it.
Yeah.
I think the Hezekiah taking credit, it's not that this happened to us by force, but no, we intended to do this. We did this on purpose. We had somebody mention that in a comment before. I think that it makes so much sense as just, you are shifting the view of this. This thing happened. Yeah. We can't deny that happened. But we can say we did it on purpose instead of we are forced to do this, which suddenly makes it a power play, which I think just in this, how we're reframing all of these same things, the idol stories, you're doing the same thing here of we're just shifting the way we're looking at this now. It was our decision. And now we can centralize and move on from there. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then they get held up as the most righteous rulers in the history of Israel for doing this thing that they may not have even wanted to do, that may have been forced upon them. For
maybe doing nothing or falling backwards into a convenient position.
Losing a battle or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think in that, it's helpful maybe to clarify too, as we're putting all of this stuff on the table as far as shifting views of idols. When people are reading these stories, trying to keep in mind some of the polemics that have happened, should we be reading those or trying to keep tabs of those as the Deuteronomistic view of idols that's going to come from Deuteronomy and after and really drive that anti-idolatry moving backwards? Or is this something you'd say is a fight that's always happening even before Deuteronomy in some of these earlier narratives of how we're viewing idols? Deuteronomy is going to do its own thing, but it's always a contested read.
I think there's a degree to which it's always contested. I'm sure there were different groups of priests that had conflict between other groups of priests. I mean, you have there's a designation. I think there's the Comer, which is a type of priest, which is kind of dismissed in the Deuteronomistic literature as an idolatrous priest or a false priesthood or something like that. And whereas the Levites and the Aaronic priesthood gets held up as the righteous side of that. So I imagine there was always competition. And certainly if Asherah was worshipped around Israel, there would have been priestesses probably, and there would have certainly been competition and conflict there. So I think there's always conflict and competition ongoing, but I think we're always looking through a Deuteronomistic lens when we're looking back that far, because it's primarily the Deuteronomistic literature that is preserving that stuff. So I don't think we can help but look through that lens, and to the degree that we can reconstruct what may have been pre-Deuteronomistic, I think it is still helpful to apply the lens of power imbalances and competition and things like that. I don't think that is, I don't see that ever being absent from the historical narratives that are being represented. I think the reason they exist is probably because of competition and conflict and things like that. So I think that's an important framework to always keep in mind.
And I like your analysis, the language that you use about renegotiation with these objects, because you certainly do have objects like the Ark, like the Nehushtan, where these are objects commanded by God to be created that were worshipped. They were at least objects that caused either did direct healing, or that caused your mind to be to cast up to the deity. So these were objects that were positively spoken about in the text. And then you have this change to where idols are objects that are representative of foreign gods that were not to be worshipped, that were not to be made, that were not to be created, but they're still representative of deities. And then later on, especially as you get into the later Second Temple period, they become wood and metal. These are not gods. So they go from being acceptable as representative of the Hebrew God to unacceptable, but still representative of actual deities, to, it's just things that are made of wood. And how could you possibly think they're being mocked, right? And you see this transition within the text of the Bible itself. I love the language that you use there. I think you're absolutely on the money.
Thank you. I think that was, I still get pushback every now and then for my renegotiation language. A lot of people are, but I think it's probably the best shorthand for understanding what's going on with the way the past is interacting with the present and the goals for the future. And I think once we get down into the New Testament too, we have Paul talking about idols, where an idol is nothing in the world, but he's also like, but there are demons that are being indexed by these. And so you kind of have the rhetoric is situationally emergent. What do we need it to be in this time? Okay, now we're going to say, they're worshiping idols of wood and stone that can't talk or speak or anything like that. And then later on, it's like, they're worshiping the deities on the other side of that, but they're just demons. They're not. And we have Paul quoting Deuteronomy 32:17, just the first part of it, where they dismiss things as shadim, but he doesn't quote the next part where those shadim are referred to as Elohim, that they did not know, gods that they did not know. So they're trying to draw such fine lines of distinction between what they do and what we do. And I think it's fascinating to observe how how that renegotiation is taking place, and how they're having to deal with the received tradition, the scriptural heritage, because even today, Protestants today have that whole Bible that they insist is inspired and inerrant, and they've got to grapple with some things that are uncomfortable, and they've come up with all kinds of different ways to account for, why, we don't do this anymore, because, if Jesus didn't mention this law in the New Testament, and that's the criterion for determining if we're still responsible for keeping this law, except for when Jesus mentions tithes, because we don't want to pay the renegotiating goes on. It's always a play between the past and the present and our goals for the future.
Yeah, that'll
never go away.
No, and that's exactly right. It's this notion that if it's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible but not in the New Testament, it's still valid. But if Jesus mentions it in the New Testament, we're okay, except if he contradicts it, or if he undoes it, or if he overrides it, until you find the one that you don't like that's an exception to this rule, and then we're just not going to talk about that one. And it's just constant cherry picking. It's this constant, and this is the problem with treating the text as a deity, literally as an idol. This is the eternal problem. With folks who treat the text not as a source of wisdom and as a record that can be consulted, but as God said it, that settles it, but only in the parts that I like to look at.
And that's the trade book I have coming out next year. It's called The Bible Says So. And that's precisely what I'm talking about, that,
Right.
If you want to take that seriously, the Bible says some awful stuff.
Yeah.
But some of the things that you want the Bible to say, it doesn't really say.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's that's something that a lot of people don't take seriously.
Yeah.
That it's always, again, a negotiation.
Right.
And what I try to point out is that what is leading the negotiation, what is in charge, is our needs and our goals today in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, which means that we're going to come up with whatever argument we need to come up with to make the text support whatever we need it to support today. And so nobody's beliefs follow downstream from the Bible. It's a feedback loop. And we're the ones in charge of the outcome of those negotiations, and idols are just one aspect of that. And we see that negotiation going on within the text. That's something that I try to help people think more about, is that it's not just people looking at the text from the outside. That stuff's going on within the text as well. The biblical authors themselves are engaged in the exact same process, which I think is one of the things that undermines that presupposition of univocality, which I think is so prevalent that it's like fish not knowing they're in water when Bible readers are just presupposing univocality without even thinking about it. They just it just strikes them as a non-starter in so many ways.
Many different authors, many different points of view, contradictory points of view, right? Job and Deuteronomy don't necessarily agree, but that was, and again, I tell my classes is that's the power of the Hebrew Bible, is that, ancient Israel is wrestling with their reality, and they said, well, Deuteronomy, you have to do it this way. This is the way God, and if you do this, you'll be blessed, and if you do this, you'll be cursed. And Job comes along and says, And the wisdom of ancient Israel was, hey, put those both in the canon, please, because that's our reality. That's the reality of human experience, is it doesn't always play like the vending machine. And we want both of those texts in our canon, because that's the human experience.
And that's a lot of people, when I talk about how two contradictory texts have been put together right next to each other, people are like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you have that? And it's, well, because they prioritize preservation over coherence and consistency a lot of times, but also, and this was something I learned when I was at Oxford at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. I developed an awful lot of what and now I'm forgetting his name, a scholar called Holy Envy, because I was there with a lot of Jewish scholars who talked an awful lot about how engaging the scriptures was more about a wrestle. That it was an invitation to wrestle with these things rather than just a one-way prescription or, constitution or rule book. It was an invitation to grapple with this and think and wrestle. And I think that's a much more, one, I think that's closer to what inevitably we're all going to do anyway. And two, I think it's a much more productive way to approach how the Bible is engaged. I think it's being a lot more honest about what the Bible is and what we're doing with it, rather than the notion that this is our rule book and, we get it. This is our scout handbook and we follow it to the letter and we get it right every time, because that's the last thing the Bible is.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, Dan, thank you for joining us today for a wide-ranging conversation. We appreciate your insight. We hit a lot of ground, so if there's anything we didn't cover that you have a question on, put it down in the comments, send us an email. I would also say go check out Dan's social media and podcast, because something you have a question on, Dan's probably addressed there as well. So you can find Dan at the Data Over Dogma podcast, and you can find Dan on all the places that you find your social media. So definitely go check him out there. But for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones for Dr. Bob Cargill and Dr. Dan McClellan. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.